He sat alone on the wooden floor of an empty room. The walls still carried the echoes of laughter that no longer lived there. Sunlight cut through the dust like golden scars, and in that silence, he finally heard what life had been trying to say all along. You can't grow while holding on. This channel tells stories inspired by Napoleon Hill's philosophy about purpose, faith, and the power of the mind. If you believe in growth through pain, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. He had spent his entire life trying to hold everything together. The company he built from nothing, the friends he thought were family, the plans that once felt certain. Every morning he woke up believing that success meant control, that if he could just hold tight enough, nothing would fall apart. But everything did. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The missed calls, the short replies, the empty promises. People who once cheered for him started disappearing one by one. And every time someone left, he tightened his grip even more, trying to prove he was still enough. The tighter he held on, the more everything slipped away. He worked longer hours, slept less, pretended to be fine. He smiled in meetings while something inside him cracked a little more each day. When he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who looked alive, but wasn't really living. He had forgotten how to breathe without a goal in front of him, forgotten how to rest without guilt, forgotten how to exist without someone's validation. Then, one evening, it all collapsed. A business partner, the last friend he trusted, walked out after an argument that wasn't even about business. It was about loyalty, about respect, about the one thing he thought would never disappear. But it did. The next morning, the office was quiet. The desk was empty. The phone no longer rang. And for the first time in years, he realized there was no one left to impress. He came home to an apartment that felt too big and too silent. The walls, once filled with conversation, now echoed back his own breathing. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of his plans, notebooks, contracts, dreams half-written. And as he looked around, something inside him finally broke. He wasn't angry anymore, just empty. For hours he sat in that silence, staring at the faint golden light creeping across the room. The city hummed in the distance, but it felt like another world, one he no longer belonged to. He thought about calling someone, anyone. But who? The truth hit him with brutal clarity. When everything else leaves, the only person you have left is yourself. At first, solitude felt like punishment. His thoughts turned dark, heavy, loud. Regret flooded in. Things he should have said, things he should have done differently. He blamed the market. He blamed fate. He blamed betrayal. And when there was no one left to blame, he turned that anger inward. The days blurred together. The clock stopped meaning anything. He avoided the mirror because he couldn't stand the man staring back. The one who had spent his whole life building an image so strong, only to realize it had been hollow all along. And yet, within that emptiness, something faint began to stir. One morning, he woke before sunrise. The apartment was still and gray. He made coffee, sat on the floor again, and just watched the light move across the wall. It was the same light as before, but somehow, it looked different. Softer. Honest. He realized he didn't have to fix anything today. He didn't have to rebuild, call anyone, or chase anything. He could just be. That morning was the first time he stopped fighting his solitude. He started to notice small details again. The smell of coffee, the hum of the fridge, the quiet rhythm of his own breath. They were things he used to overlook, too busy trying to control the next moment. And in that silence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: presence. He remembered a passage from Napoleon Hill that once sounded like philosophy, but now felt like truth. Every adversity, every failure, every heartbreak carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. For the first time, he understood what it meant. The collapse wasn't the end of his story. It was the clearing of space, the destruction of what was false, so something real could finally take root. He wasn't being punished. He was being purified. So he stayed there, still and quiet, letting the noise fade. He stopped asking why everyone left and started asking what their absence was trying to teach him. And in that moment, something small but powerful shifted inside him. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to find out. Days turned into weeks, and the noise of the world faded into something distant and unreal. He stopped checking his phone, not because he didn't care, but because there was no one left to call. The silence of his apartment was thick, almost alive, like it was watching him, waiting for him to finally stop pretending. At first, that silence was unbearable. It was a mirror he couldn't escape. Every time he tried to distract himself, it followed. He played music, but the notes only made the emptiness louder. He tried reading, but the words dissolved into his thoughts. He went for long walks at night, hoping the city lights could drown his mind. But no matter where he went, the silence came too, a quiet presence behind every sound. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of truth. And truth, he realized, was what he had been running from all along. The truth that he had built his identity around being needed, around being the one who could fix everything, carry everyone, never fail. The truth that he had confused success with significance. The truth that he had spent his life performing strength instead of living it. He had spent years chasing validation, the nods, the praise, the partnerships. And now, in their absence, he felt stripped of meaning. But as the days passed, that emptiness began to take a different shape. It wasn't punishment, it was purification. He started noticing things again. The sound of rain against the window. The way sunlight moved across the wall in slow patterns every morning. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, steady and calm. Life was still there. It had always been there. He had just been too loud to hear it. He began waking early, before the city stirred. He'd make coffee, sit cross-legged on the floor, and breathe. Sometimes he wrote a few words in a notebook. Sometimes he just stared at the light. There was no agenda, no productivity checklist. Just stillness. In those quiet hours, he began writing. Not for business, not to impress, but to understand. His words poured out like confession. He wrote about failure, about pride, about the ache of letting go. And as he wrote, he noticed that every line carried less resistance. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't chasing explanations. He was just observing, like a man studying his own soul. One entry simply said, "What I fear losing is what controls me." Another, "Maybe everything falling apart was the only way to set me free." He didn't know where those words came from. They felt like they weren't written by him, but through him. That's when he remembered something from Think and Grow Rich. Napoleon Hill's reminder that every mind is connected to a higher intelligence, a silent power waiting to respond to belief. He began to wonder, what if silence wasn't empty at all? What if it was communication, from the part of himself that he had neglected the most? He decided to test this theory. Every morning, he would sit quietly and ask one question out loud. What do I need to learn today? And then he'd wait. Sometimes the answer came as a feeling, sometimes as a memory, sometimes as a sudden thought that made perfect sense. Other times, there was nothing but quiet. But even that began to feel like an answer. He realized that solitude was not loneliness. Loneliness was the hunger for others. Solitude was the presence of yourself. He started studying again, but this time, he chose differently. Instead of business books, he read about stillness, faith, and discipline. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, Napoleon Hill. He underlined phrases that once felt theoretical but now burned with truth. Self-control is strength. Right thought is mastery. Calmness is power. Your only limitation is the one you set up in your own mind. The words sank into him. They weren't lessons anymore. They were reminders of what he already knew but had forgotten in the noise. He realized that the reason he'd fallen so far wasn't bad luck. It was attachment. Attachment to outcomes, to identities, to people who were never meant to stay. He'd tried to anchor himself to a world that was always changing, and when it moved, it tore him apart. Now, in silence, he began learning to float instead of fight. Each day became a ritual. He would clean the room, not because it mattered, but because order outside brought peace inside. He would meditate, not to escape his mind, but to train it. He began exercising again, slow and deliberate, feeling every breath, every motion. His world had shrunk to 4 walls, but inside those walls, he found expansion. He discovered that when you remove the noise of the world, you begin to hear the whisper of your purpose. And that whisper was growing stronger. It told him that what he lost wasn't taken from him. It was returned to where it belonged. That the friendships that ended had completed their purpose. That the failures he mourned were the tuition for wisdom. He started to see life differently, not as something happening to him, but as something happening for him. Every loss had been a teacher. Every silence, a mentor. Every ending, a divine correction. One night, Sitting by the window with the city lights glowing below, he whispered, "I understand now." He didn't need to explain what he understood. The silence already knew. He smiled for the first time in months. Not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside had. He was no longer resisting. He was receiving. He thought about all those years he spent chasing success, love, validation, all the things he thought would make him whole. And now, in the absence of all of it, he finally felt complete. He understood now that solitude is not the end of the journey. It's where the real journey begins. Because when everything external is stripped away, the only thing left is truth. And if you can face that truth without running, you become unshakable. He looked around his quiet apartment one last time before going to bed. The silence no longer frightened him. It had become sacred. And that night, for the first time in years, he slept in peace. Not because he had what he wanted, but because he had finally let go of everything that was never his to keep. When the silence finally stopped feeling like an enemy, it became his foundation. He no longer feared empty mornings or quiet nights. They became sacred ground, the soil where something new could grow. He woke each day before sunrise. The world was still dark, the city half asleep, and for the first time, he felt aligned with something greater than himself. He didn't rush. He didn't scroll. He moved with intention. He began each morning by making his bed, a simple act of order that felt like a promise to himself. Then he brewed coffee and sat by the same window that once mocked him with its emptiness. Now the light that poured through it felt like company, warm, forgiving, alive. He opened a small notebook and wrote a single line each day. Sometimes it was a quote from Hill or Marcus Aurelius, sometimes a thought that came to him while meditating. You cannot grow while clinging. The man who controls his mind controls his world. Today I build, not because I must, but because I can. He no longer planned his life in years or projects. He built it in moments, one deliberate choice at a time. He began working again, not on the grand empire he once imagined, but on something smaller, simpler, work that came from purpose, not pride. He reached out to old contacts, but without the hunger for validation that once drove him. He spoke less, listened more, and found that people responded differently. There was a quiet authority in him now, a steadiness that came from having survived himself. He realized that solitude had made him unshakable, because once you've faced yourself, nothing outside can truly scare you again. Every setback became lighter, every disappointment easier to carry. He didn't force outcomes anymore. He moved with patience, knowing that life had its own timing. In those days of rebuilding, he discovered the quiet joy of consistency. Each small task done with care became a meditation. Cleaning his apartment, cooking his own meals, reading before bed. It wasn't about productivity, it was about presence. He stopped comparing himself to others. The race he once ran had vanished, and with it, the pressure that used to drive his every move. For the first time, he wasn't competing. He was creating. He found new strength in simplicity. The silence that once punished him had turned into rhythm. When opportunities returned, and they did, he met them calmly. No excitement, no desperation, just gratitude. He understood now that success is not something you chase. It's something you attract when you become the kind of person who can hold it. He no longer said yes to everything. He valued his energy the way others valued time. He learned to say no without guilt, to people, projects, distractions that didn't align with his peace. Each no was an act of protection. Each boundary, a declaration of self-respect. He thought of what Napoleon Hill wrote about definiteness of purpose, how a man without direction is like a ship without a rudder. And yet, for the first time, his purpose didn't feel like a goal. It felt like a state of being. His direction wasn't outward anymore. It was inward. He started exercising again, not to sculpt his body, but to discipline his mind. Each rep was a reminder that strength is built through repetition, through showing up when no one's watching. He began meditating for longer periods, exploring the stillness he once avoided. Sometimes tears came without warning, not from sadness, but from the quiet release of everything he had carried. He realized that healing doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives with silence. One evening, as the sun set beyond the window, he sat with his journal and wrote a single sentence. Peace is not what happens when you have control. Peace is what remains when you stop needing it. That night, He remembered all the nights he used to pray for strength, strength to fight, to endure, to win. And he realized life had given him exactly that, but not in the way he expected. Strength had come disguised as isolation. Endurance had come wrapped in failure. He had learned what few ever do, that survival is not victory. Transformation is. In solitude, he had become a man who no longer feared losing anything. Because he finally understood, nothing real can be lost. He started walking outside more, reconnecting with the world not as an escape, but as participation. He greeted strangers, smiled at small things, the laughter of a child, a gust of wind, a stray cat sleeping in the sun. Life wasn't dull anymore. It was vivid, detailed, breathing. He no longer needed the world to see him. He could finally see it. And slowly, almost invisibly, life began to move in his favor again. Work returned. New connections appeared. Small victories accumulated. But they didn't excite him like before, because now he understood, success is not proof of worth. It is a reflection of peace. He had stopped chasing. He had started flowing. What once broke him had now built him. The same solitude that once felt like exile had turned into his sanctuary. And deep inside, he whispered a quiet truth that had carried him through it all. You don't rebuild life by holding tighter, you rebuild it by letting go. Time passed, not as an escape, but as a quiet companion. The man who once measured his life by noise now lived by rhythm. The slow, steady rhythm of breath, sunlight, and faith. What once felt like exile had become home. What once was silence had become symphony. He no longer woke up chasing a finish line. The moment he opened his eyes, he already felt enough. He brewed his morning coffee in stillness, a sacred ritual now, the scent filling the air like incense. The same sunlight that once fell across the empty floor now illuminated a life rebuilt from within. The apartment was no longer empty. It held books, small plants, signs of life. But more importantly, it held peace. Real peace, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind that doesn't leave when people do. He didn't rebuild his world by force. He let it regrow, naturally, like a forest after fire. His business returned, not as a monument to ego, but as a vessel for service. Clients came not because of his promises, but because of his presence. He didn't sell, he inspired. His words had weight now, not from authority, but from alignment. When he spoke, it wasn't to convince, it was to connect. He understood something Napoleon Hill had written, but that only life could teach. When you are ready for a thing, it will make its appearance. He had stopped chasing what wasn't meant for him, and that's when the right things began to find him. Opportunities reappeared. Friendships returned in new forms. Even love, patient, grounded, gentle, found its way back to him. But this time, he didn't cling. He had learned that love is not possession, it's partnership. That real connection doesn't cage you, it expands you. He lived lighter now. Fewer things, fewer words, fewer worries. What remained was essence. Each morning, he still opened his notebook and wrote the same 3 words. Faith, discipline, gratitude. They had become the trinity of his rebirth. Faith, because nothing moves until you believe. Discipline, because belief without action is illusion. Gratitude, because abundance begins the moment you recognize what you already have. He had learned that peace is not found in the absence of problems, but in the presence of purpose. He became known quietly as someone people trusted, not because of titles or achievements, but because there was something unshakable in him, a calmness that couldn't be faked. People came to him asking how he did it, expecting steps, secrets, strategies. He smiled and told them the truth few want to hear. You have to lose what you think you need to find what you actually are. They looked at him confused, the way he once looked at truth, until they, too, reached their breaking points. Only then would his words bloom inside them. Because wisdom doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in collapse. One evening, he sat by the window watching the city breathe. The skyline flickered with life, 1,000 stories unfolding at once. He smiled, remembering his own story, the one that began in pain and ended in peace. He had once thought solitude was a curse. Now, he saw it as the universe's most sacred classroom. He poured himself tea and opened his old journals, pages filled with the words of a man who had been lost, afraid, and angry. The handwriting looked like someone else's. It was almost hard to believe that he had once been that man. But he didn't feel shame, only compassion. Because without that version of himself, this one could never have been born. He realized then, growth isn't becoming someone new. It's returning to who you were before the world taught you fear. He remembered what Hill wrote about faith. Faith is the eternal elixir which gives life, power, and action to the impulse of thought. He whispered the line out loud. It sounded different now, not like philosophy, but like fact. He understood that letting go is not weakness. It's the purest act of faith. To release control is to trust that life knows the way better than you do. He began teaching quietly, not in classrooms or stages, but in moments, in conversations with friends, in messages to strangers. He would say, "Your pain is not punishment. It's preparation. What leaves is not meant to hurt you. It's meant to free you. You cannot receive while your hands are clenched." People began to call him the quiet one. He liked that, because he had learned that true power doesn't raise its voice, it radiates. He had become living proof that solitude does not destroy, it transforms. That silence is not emptiness, it's the birthplace of meaning. That letting go is not the end, it's the passageway to beginning again. Still, he never saw himself as enlightened, just awake, aware that every moment, even peace, requires practice. So he kept practicing. Each morning, discipline. Each night, gratitude. Each day, faith. And with every breath, a little less resistance. He no longer feared losing people or things. Because he finally knew that what's real never truly leaves. It changes form, but it remains. The people meant for your journey will return when you've become ready to meet them again, differently. Sometimes, at night, he still spoke to the silence. He'd say thank you. Thank you for breaking me. Thank you for rebuilding me. Thank you for not giving me what I wanted, and giving me what I needed instead. The silence never answered. It didn't need to. Its presence was the reply. He closed his eyes and felt something powerful, not happiness, not excitement, but serenity. The kind of quiet joy that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind of peace that can only come after the storm. He thought back to the man who once sat on that same floor years ago, cross-legged, surrounded by nothing but boxes, shame, and silence. That man had begged for relief. This man was grateful for the lesson. He smiled, realizing that he hadn't just survived being alone. He had learned to thrive within it. Because solitude had introduced him to his greatest companion, himself. He finally understood the wisdom behind every loss, every silence, every ending. Life never takes without purpose. It only removes what blocks the path to what's true. He whispered one last note in his journal before bed. When you stop chasing the world starts finding you. He placed the pen down, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark. The city outside was alive, breathing, pulsing, just like him. He smiled softly, eyes closed, whispering to the quiet that had once terrified him. You were never my punishment. You were my teacher. And for the first time in his life, he didn't need anything more. He didn't need applause, or answers, or tomorrow. He had peace, and peace, he had learned, is not a destination. It is the beginning of everything. Sparkles, if this story touched you, subscribe to Napoleon Hill Stories, and tell me in the comments what you're ready to let go of tonight. Because the next chapter of your life will begin the moment you release what was never meant to stay.